You are watching DHTV from California State University, Dominguez Hills.
Okay, in this presentation, what we're going to do is try to cover the conservative agenda since the 1970s. And we will try to appreciate something about how there's always anti-democratic forces pitted against progressive reform. So in this particular case, we're going to start with the reaction to the Johnson's Great Society and the Vietnam War, especially the protests. So let's appreciate something about the generations that are going to arise after Vietnam. And let's start with the women. You know, one of the things that happened in the 1970s, rather than relying on the Equal Employment Opportunity Commission to prove that an employer intentionally discriminated against an individual, some people argued that it was possible to prove discrimination by using statistics on the relative numbers of women and minorities that were hired or promoted by an employer. The term affirmative action refers to efforts to show improvement in the hiring of minorities. Now, the first major affirmative action program was known as the Philadelphia Plan, and it applied to Philadelphia businesses that held contracts with the federal government. Affirmative action programs that reduced the number of white men hired and increased the number of minorities and women hired caused resentment amongst white working class men during the recession of the 1970s. Betty Friedan came out with a book called The Feminine Mystique, and it helped revive the women's movement by presenting ideas concerning the dissatisfaction of educated wives and mothers. And at the time of its founding in 1966, the primary goal of the National Organization of Women was to lobby for an enforcement of sex discrimination provision of the 1964 Civil Rights Act. So in the late 1960s, the view of radical feminists differed from those of the National Organization of Women in that radical feminists practiced personal politics through such venues as consciousness-raising groups. The National Organization of Women was turned into a traditional lobbying group. Now, the Supreme Court cases are very important because the ruling in Roe versus Wade secured the understanding that the right to privacy guaranteed in the Constitution protects a woman's decision to do what she wants with her body. And in this particular case, the issue was abortion. And beginning in the early 1970s, the significant increase in the participation of women in sports at colleges and universities can be traced in large part to Title IX of the Higher Education Act. It was passed by Congress in 1972. In the early 1970s, the admission of record numbers of women to professional schools assisted in the development of the modern middle class. And in their campaign against the Equal Rights Amendment, anti-feminist leaders argued that the ERA would discriminate or would decriminalize rape and make women subject to the military draft. So again, there are always anti-progressive forces pitted against progressive reform. And in this particular case, anti-feminists were successful in stalling the ratification of the ERA or the Equal Rights Amendment. Then there is the question of the gay movement. The Stonewall Inn riot marked the symbolic beginning of the gay rights movement. And the Vietnam policy that was devised by President Nixon and Henry Kissinger included increased bombing of North Vietnam coupled with the withdrawal of some American troops. Then there was the 1970 campus protest at Kent State University that ended with the death of 4 students that occurred in response to the incursion of American troops in Cambodia. Now, the Pentagon Papers are going to reveal that American leaders had consistently lied to the American people about the Vietnam War. William Calley was an Army lieutenant that was convicted for his involvement in the atrocity known as the My Lai Massacre. This massacre of some 300 unarmed South Vietnamese civilians by American soldiers took place in 1968. The terms of the Paris Peace Accords that ended the American participation in the war in Vietnam was the promise that the United States made to withdraw all of its remaining troops from Vietnam within 60 days. But hawkish critics debating the meaning of the Vietnam War is going to blame the nation's failure in Vietnam on a loss of will within America. The War Powers Act of 1973 attempted to limit the president's war-making power. Now, the primary reason for the post-traumatic stress disorder suffered by thousands of Vietnam veterans was soldiers seeing large numbers of women, children, and elderly people killed. But through the Nixon Doctrine, President Nixon and his advisors demonstrated the belief that the United States, for financial reasons, would have to rely on regional allies to contain the Cold War, or communism as it was known under the Cold War rhetoric. The primary purpose of the Nixon-Kissinger policy of détente was to check Soviet expansion and limit the Soviet arms buildup. Then in 1972, the arms agreement between the United States and the Soviet Union attempted to slow the arms race by limiting anti-ballistic missile defenses. And one of the ways in which President Nixon and his Secretary of State, Henry Kissinger, tried to weaken communism was by improving relations with both the Soviet Union and the People's Republic of China at a time when tensions were increasing between those two communist nations. And after President Nixon's opening to China, American and Chinese conferees reached an agreement that the Soviet Union should not be allowed to make gains in Asia. And in 1975, Secretary of State Kissinger persuaded Israel and Egypt to accept a United Nations peacekeeping force in the Sinai. The Nixon administration's response, though, to the election of Salvador Allende as president of Chile in 1970 was very bold. The administration worked through the CIA to encourage Chilean military officers to overthrow Allende. Two countries in which Nixon's foreign policies and operations by the CIA reflected Cold War fears of leftist-inspired instability were Angola and Chile. Now, based on his domestic policy initiatives, President Nixon was a very cunning politician who seemingly supported a liberal agenda, but who ultimately had conservative goals. An element of Richard Nixon's Southern strategy was his nomination of two Southerners for positions on the Supreme Court. And in response to the Supreme Court's ruling in the case Swan versus Charlotte Mecklenburg, President Nixon said that busing as a remedy to end segregated schools was reckless and extreme. But Richard Nixon's crime in the Watergate scandal was an obstruction of justice because he ordered the CIA to stop the FBI's investigation of the break-in at the offices of the Democratic National Convention. The code name that was used by journalists Carl Bernstein and Bob Woodward for the high-ranking government official who helped them uncover the link between the men who broke into the Democratic National Committee offices in the Watergate and the Nixon White House was Deep Throat. And the House Judiciary Committee then voted to impeach President Nixon on 3 counts, including obstruction of justice. So President Richard Nixon's second term ended with his resignation in the face of certain impeachment and conviction. Gerald Ford was the first unelected president in U.S. history. One of Gerald Ford's first official acts as president, of course, was to pardon Richard Nixon. And then in the 1976 presidential campaign, Jimmy Carter presented himself to the electorate as an honest politician. And the establishment of an environmental superfund to clean up abandoned chemical waste sites was an early accomplishment of the Carter administration. But the feature of the 1970s American economy that economists called stagflation consisted of economic stagnation with a combination of high unemployment and high inflation. As unemployment mounted in 1974, the federal government found that policies designed to deal with unemployment only fueled the already substantial inflation rate. The inflation of the early 1970s, though, was caused in part by President Johnson's decision to wage an expensive war in Vietnam while also increasing spending on Great Society programs. Higher labor costs, accompanied by a decline in productivity, made it difficult for major industries to hold the line against inflation in the 1970s. And a major cause of the inflation in the 1970s was the Organization of Petroleum Exporting Countries, or OPEC, as they increased their prices. And in the wake of skyrocketing oil prices, the United States experienced rising unemployment accompanied by a serious inflationary spiral. So according to the tenets of monetary theory, a prescription for reducing inflation is if less money is available, price increases will slow and an inflationary spiral will end. So the answer was deindustrialization. And as a consequence of deindustrialization was that many blue-collar workers lost their jobs in the automobile and steel industries and found that the new jobs being created were in the lower-paid service sector. Then there came Love Canal, 3 Mile Island, and the Cuyahoga River. They are very important sites of an environmental disaster. And finally, in Regents of the University of California versus Bakke, the Supreme Court ruled in Bakke's favor and upheld the principle of affirmative action. President Carter's inconsistency in foreign policy was due in large part to the disagreements between his national security advisor and his Secretary of State. And the treaties that President Carter signed with Panama gave the United States the right to defend the Panama Canal after it was returned to Panama in the year 2000. And among President Jimmy Carter's successes was the brokering of the first treaty between Israel and an Arab state. A provision of the Camp David Accords was Israel's promise to withdraw troops from the Sinai. The Carter Doctrine proclaimed that the United States would intervene against Soviet aggression in the Persian Gulf. In an attempt to free the American hostages in Iran, President Carter ordered a daring rescue mission that failed. So that leads us to the 1980s and to the present, and leads us to President Reagan. And here we need to appreciate what I'm wearing in my shirt. Among President Reagan's accomplishments was the restoration of a mood of confidence and optimism in an America shaken by the social and economic crisis of the 1970s. So the conservative agenda kicks in with the election of Reagan. Now, as governor of California, Ronald Reagan signed one of the nation's most liberal abortion laws. But one of the items on Reagan's agenda at the beginning of his first term was the weakening of federal environmental, health, and safety regulations. And during the Reagan administration, those appointed to head federal regulatory agencies often opposed the federal regulations that they were supposed to enforce. So during President Reagan's first term, the nation's environmental movement is going to be re-energized because of the views and actions of Reagan's Secretary of the Interior, James Watt. When the 11,300 members of the Professional Air Traffic and Controllers Organization went on strike in 1981, President Reagan fired the strikers and barred them from ever being rehired as federal air traffic controllers. And as president, Ronald Reagan pleased the new right by supporting prayer in public schools. So if we can get that, we can understand that what the Reagan Revolution was all about was anti-environment, anti-union, anti-gay, anti-minority, and anti-poor. So again, let's appreciate why we need to wake the folk up. The first woman associate justice of the Supreme Court was Sandra Day O'Connor. President Reagan's appointment to the Supreme Court made that body more conservative. The ruling by the Supreme Court in Bowers versus Hardwick is evidence of the conservative turn. 20 years in jail for consensual anal or oral sex between men. Now, according to advocates of supply-side economics, an increase in savings and investments by the upper class and corporations would lead to renewed prosperity as profits from the top down trickled to the middle and lower classes. As a result of President Reagan's economic policies, the United States, though, became the world's largest debtor nation. And as a believer in supply-side economics, Reagan called for lower income tax rates for individuals and corporations. Economic activity declined and the unemployment rate increased as a consequence of the Federal Reserve Board's 1981 decision to tighten the money supply. Now, on an opposite note, a reason for the decline in inflation during the first years of President Reagan's presidency was the Federal Reserve's decision to raise interest rates or bank loans to unprecedented levels. And in his 1984 re-election campaign, President Reagan used television ads that proclaimed, quote unquote, "America is back," while showing heartwarming images of American life. Now, among the distinguishing features of the nation's economic picture in the Reagan years was a wave of mergers, often in the form of hostile takeovers. Plus, the military buildup supported by the Reagan administration was based on the belief that such a buildup would intimidate the Soviet Union. And in the Reagan Doctrine, the Reagan administration declared that it would openly support anti-communist forces fighting the Soviets or Soviet-backed governments. What was covert and kept from the public in the 1950s and 1960s became overt and in full view in the 1980s. And in response to the overthrow of the Somoza government by revolutionaries in Nicaragua, The Reagan administration used the CIA to train and arm counter-revolutionaries whose goal it was to overthrow the Sandinista regime. And under Reagan, the United States supplied military aid to oppose any government that came to power in Nicaragua. Oliver North, William Casey, and John Poindexter used money from the Iran arms deal to subvert the will of Congress by providing funds to aid the Contras in Nicaragua. American credibility is going to be damaged as a result of the covert arms sales to Iran because America traded with a country that it condemned as a terrorist state and with which it had demanded its allies not trade. President Reagan's popularity declined and his authority over foreign affairs is going to be diminished after 1986. It was largely as a result of the disclosure of the administration's illegal diversion of money from a secret arms sale to Iran to fund the Contras in Nicaragua. Now, after arriving in Lebanon in 1982 as a peacekeeping force, American troops became involved in the hostilities between warring Lebanese factions. And in the late 1980s, Yasser Arafat, who was chief of the Palestinian Liberation Organization, publicly rejected terrorism and accepted the right of Israel to live in peace and security in its early years. The Reagan administration responded to the segregationist policy, and then in its early years, President Reagan's administration responded to the segregationist policy of apartheid and political repression in South Africa by following the policy of what was known as constructive engagement. And likewise, in his foreign policy, 1985 and 1986, talks between Soviet and American officials on strategic arms control stalled because President Reagan refused to limit the Strategic Defense Initiative, otherwise known as Star Wars. The two superpowers agreed to destroy all their land-based intermediate-range nuclear missiles in Europe in the 1987 INF Treaty. Now, the new right that came to the fore in the 1980s is closely associated with fundamentalist Christianity. Women in the United States during the 1970s and 1980s are going to take advantage of employment opportunities as they worked in increasing numbers outside the home, often from economic necessity. And during the 1980s, a major reason for the increase in the poverty rate in America was a decrease in well-paying blue-collar jobs and an increase in lower-paying service jobs. And the quadrupling of the prison population experienced in the United States during the 1980s is closely associated with the use of illegal drugs. A reason for the increase in homelessness rates during the 1980s was the release of many psychiatric patients from state mental hospitals. And in the 1980s, most immigrants to the United States were from Latin America and Asia. And during the 1970s and 1980s, Latinos constituted America's fastest growing minority. So the purpose of the Immigration Reform and Control Act, known as the Simpson-Rodino Act of 1986, was to stem the flow of illegal immigrants into the United States by penalizing employers who hired undocumented workers. So this is the hodgepodge of information that you're getting from the textbooks about the 1970s and 1980s. Now, comes the election of 1988, and the characteristic of the 1988 presidential campaign was the Republican reliance on negative campaigning and the Republican reliance on personal attacks against the Democratic candidate. And this had become a permanent feature on the political landscape. The ads by Republicans became ever more vicious. In November 1989, with the destruction of the Berlin Wall, it was a clear indication that the Soviet domination of Eastern Europe was coming to an end. Likewise, the response of the Chinese government to student pro-democracy demonstrations in Tiananmen Square in June 1989 was incredible. So the army in China stormed the square and massacred hundreds of demonstrators. The Tiananmen Square incident was the use of armed force by the Chinese government to quell pro-democracy rallies in Beijing. And the major reasons for the disintegration of the Soviet Union and the end of the Cold War in the late 1980s was the rise to power of Mikhail Gorbachev. The Bush administration decided to force Panama's General Manuel Antonio Noriega from power because revelations concerning Noriega's drug trafficking activities caused protests in Panama. And as a result of the invasion of Panama in 1989, The United States captured Manuel Noriega and tried him for drug trafficking. The 1991 Persian Gulf War was caused by Iraq's invasion of Kuwait. And the reason the United States sent troops to the Persian Gulf and engaged in the 1991 Persian Gulf War was to defend Saudi Arabian oil exports to the United States and force Iraq to abandon its takeover of Kuwait. So President George Bush, H.W. Bush, Father Bush, committed American troops in the 1991 Persian Gulf War only after getting approval of both America's allies and Congress. And many Americans were against the 1991 Persian Gulf War because they believed that the economic sanctions against Iraq should be given more time to work. And President George H.W. Bush's nomination of Clarence Thomas to the Supreme Court ran into difficulty when Thomas was accused of sexually harassing a female who had worked for him. So that concludes the conservative agenda for the 1970s and 1980s. And we'll call this part one, and then we'll get to part two.